Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I saw it from the harbour at 11:30 at night, which was later than I was usually at the harbour, but I'd been finishing a report on the fuel dock's pump system that had taken longer than expected, and I was walking to my truck when I looked out at the headland and stopped. The light was on. Not a lamp someone had left burning in the keeper's quarters. The light, the Fresnel lens turning in the lamp room, throwing its beam in the pattern it had run when the lighthouse was active. The same 2-second flash and 4-second dark that mariners had used to identify Aldrin Point for 60 years before the decommissioning. I stood in the harbour parking lot and watched it sweep across the water and come back and sweep again. The Aldrin Point Lighthouse had been dark since 1984, 40 years since the Carver disaster, when a container ship had gone down on the shoals west of the point, and the subsequent investigation had determined that the lighthouse's signal had contributed to a navigational error rather than prevented one, and the Maritime Authority had decommissioned it as part of the broader infrastructure review that had followed. The light had gone out in October of that year and had not come on since. I knew the lighthouse the way I knew every piece of coastal infrastructure in my maintenance area, which was practically and in detail. I'd been up the tower a dozen times in 16 years, checking the structural integrity of the masonry and the lantern room glazing and the mechanical housing of the lens assembly, noting the slow deterioration that came to any structure left without active use, and doing what I could to slow it. The machinery in the lamp room hadn't turned since 1984, and the Fresnel lens sat in its housing gathering the particular dust of a confined space that nobody opened regularly. I got back in my truck and drove out to the headland. The lighthouse was a 2-mile drive from the harbour, the last half-mile on an unpaved road that the town maintained, because the structure was historically listed and someone had to access it for the quarterly checks. I drove it with my work lights on, the gravel familiar under the tyres, and I could see the beam from the road the whole way, steady and regular, the pattern unchanged from what it had been 40 years ago. I parked at the base of the tower and got out and looked up. The lamp room was lit from inside, the Fresnel lens casting its characteristic beam, and through the lantern room windows, I could see movement. Someone in the lamp room tending the mechanism. The door at the base of the tower was unlocked, which it shouldn't have been, and I went in and climbed the spiral staircase to the top. The woman at the top was maybe 40, wearing work clothes that were practical and worn in the specific way of a person who did physical work outdoors regularly, and she was checking something on the clockwork drive mechanism for the lens rotation with the focused attention of someone in the middle of a job. She looked up when I came through the hatch, and her expression was not guilty or alarmed. It was the expression of someone who had been expecting someone to come and was glad the wait was over. She said her name was Aldis. She said she was the keeper of this lighthouse and had been for 18 years, and that she understood that needed some explaining. I told her it did. She explained it the way a person explains something they'd been rehearsing on the way to the conversation, which was to say directly and in the right order. The most relevant facts first. In her world, the Carver disaster hadn't happened. A different sequence of events in 1984 had kept the container ship on a safe heading. The Lighthouse had stayed operational, and Aldrin Point had continued to guide coastal traffic through the channel. She'd taken over the keeper position 18 years ago from the man who'd held it before her, and had maintained the light the same way it had been maintained since its installation. She said the lighthouse itself, the same physical structure in both our worlds, had become thin over the years. 40 years of active use on her side, pressing against 40 years of abandonment on mine, had made the tower the thinnest crossing point on this section of coast. She'd become aware of the other side gradually, through the specific sensitivity that came with long-term occupation of a thin place, and she'd spent the past several years understanding what she was feeling. She said she'd crossed tonight deliberately. She said there was a ship in trouble on her side, a bulk carrier navigating the approach to the channel in conditions that had deteriorated faster than the forecast had indicated. The coastline on her side had shifted over the decades in ways that the old charts didn't fully reflect, and the lighthouse was the critical fixed reference for that approach. But the ship had a navigational systems failure, and her side's Coast Guard cutter was 2 hours out, and the ship was going to be in serious trouble on the shoals in less than 1. She said this world's Coast Guard station was 15 minutes from the harbor. She said she needed me to get them on the water. I want to be honest about the fact that I stood in the lamproom of a lighthouse that had been dark for 40 years and looked at a woman who said she was its keeper from another world, and the conversation in my head about whether to take her seriously lasted about 4 seconds. Not because I'd been primed for this kind of thing, because she was standing at the mechanism of a lens assembly that hadn't turned since 1984, and it was turning, and she was tending it with the practiced ease of someone who did it every week, and the light was going out across the water in the pattern it had always gone, and either all of that was true or none of it was, and the none of it option didn't produce a coherent explanation. I went back down the tower and called the Coast Guard station from the base. The duty officer was a man I knew by name, Paris, who I had worked alongside on harbour infrastructure projects for years, and when I told him there was a distressed vessel in the approach channel, he didn't ask me how I knew. He asked for the last known position and the nature of the distress, and I relayed both of those up the stairs to Aldis, and she gave them to me with the specificity of someone who had been watching the situation closely, and I gave them to Paris, and I heard the station begin its response procedure. Paris asked me how I'd received the vessel information. I told him I had a source at the lighthouse with eyes on the channel. He said he'd been watching the lighthouse from the station and that it was lit. I told him it was. He said he'd ask me about that later, and right now he had a cutter to launch, and he got off the phone. I went back up the tower. Aldis was at the windows of the lamproom, looking out at the water, and I came up beside her and looked with her. From the lamproom, the channel was visible for a long distance in both directions, the beam sweeping across it every 6 seconds, and I couldn't see the ship she was watching because it wasn't in my timeline's water, but I could see her watching it, and the quality of her attention told me what the situation was. She talked me through it without being asked, describing the ship's position and movement and the drift she was tracking. and I listened because the information was going to Paris via my phone, and Paris needed it to direct the cutter. I've done coordination work in harbour emergencies before, not often, but enough to have a sense of how it ran, and what we were doing in that lamp room for the next 40 minutes was coordination work. Me relaying what Aldous was seeing to Paris on the water, and Paris relaying back what the cutter was observing, so I could tell Aldous and Aldous could adjust her assessment of the ship's drift accordingly. The two timelines are running parallel, the ship in one and the cutter in the other, bridged by a lighthouse that existed in both, and a keeper and a maintenance worker standing in the same lamp room 40 feet above the headland. At some point in the middle of it, I stopped thinking about the strangeness of the situation and focused on the work, which was the right response, and which I think Aldous had been counting on when she'd crossed over and waited for someone with the right kind of job to come through the door. The ship's crew was brought safely to shore. Aldous told me when it was done, the tension in her posture releasing in the specific way of someone who has been watching a situation and has just watched it resolve. She said the cutter had gotten a line to the ship and the crew was off, and the ship was being managed by the salvage team from the station. She said thank you. She said it simply, and she looked tired the way a person looked tired after a long night of doing something that mattered. I asked her if the lighthouse had been the right call. She said she hadn't had another one. She said the crossing was the only resource she had that could get help to the ship's crew in the window available, and that she'd known it would mean explaining herself, but that the explaining was the cheaper cost. I told her the explaining had been fine. She looked at me with the expression of a person who understood they'd put someone in an unusual position and was acknowledging it without over-apologizing for it. I asked her about the lighthouse, about 18 years of keeping a light that most people I knew had only ever seen dark. She talked about it for a while, standing in the lamp room with the lens still turning and the beam going out across the water, the same beam that had guided ships through that channel for 60 years before the Carver disaster in my world. She talked about the maintenance of it, the clockwork drive and the Fresnel lens, and the seasonal work on the tower structure and the fuel and the log and the particular relationship with weather that came from living and working at a headland exposed to the full weight of coastal conditions. I knew the structure. I'd maintained it from the outside for 16 years, and she'd maintained it from the inside for 18. And we talked about it the way two people talked about a piece of infrastructure they both respected, which was with the specific affection of people who understood what kept the mechanism going. At some point, she said she needed to go back. She said the crossing window had been tied to the active emergency, and with the emergency resolved, it wouldn't hold much longer. I told her to go. She turned the light off. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the professional shutdown of a keeper who'd been running a lighthouse for 18 years and knew the procedure. The beam stopped, and the lamp room went to the ambient darkness of a clear coastal night, and the headland outside the windows was lit only by stars and the far lights of the harbour. She went through the hatch, and I heard her footsteps on the stairs, and then the sound of the base door, and then nothing. I stood in the lamp room for a while. The Fresnel lens sat in its housing the way it had sat for 40 years, the machinery still, the lamp room dark. Through the windows the channel ran in both directions, ordinary and dark, the same water it had always been. I went down the stairs and locked the base door, which I had a key for because it was my maintenance area, and drove back to the harbour. I filed a report with the Coast Guard station the next morning, which was a version of the truth that covered what Paris needed for his paperwork without containing anything he couldn't process in a professional context. He was a practical man, and he'd been in maritime work for 20 years, and when I told him the source of the vessel information had been a keeper at the Lighthouse who'd had visual contact with the approach channel, he wrote down keeper at Lighthouse, visual contact, and didn't ask follow-up questions. He said the crew was fine. He said the ship had sustained hull damage, but nothing that couldn't be addressed in dry dock. He said the timing of the cutter's deployment had been close, and that the quality of the position information they'd been working from had been what made it manageable. I thanked him and went to do my day's work. The following Thursday, I was back at the Lighthouse for the scheduled quarterly structural check, which I'd been doing every 3 months for 16 years, and which had the comfortable routine of a task whose requirements I knew completely. The tower was sound. The masonry showed the same hairline weathering as the last check, nothing structural. The expected pace of a well-built historic structure aging at the rate old things aged when they were properly attended to. I climbed to the lamp room. The Fresnel lens sat in its housing. The clockwork drive mechanism sat in its housing. The lamp room smelled of the specific confined dust it always smelled of, nothing unusual. I went to the drive mechanism and crouched down beside it and ran my hand along the housing. It was warm. Not warm from the night outside, not warm from the building's structure, warm from recent operation, the warmth that machinery held for some time after it had been running, the residual heat of a mechanism that had been turning within the past week. I looked at the lens assembly. Up close, with the daylight through the lantern room windows, I could see what I couldn't have seen from the deck of the tower. The lens housing showed the marks of recent cleaning, the dust redistributed in the pattern of someone who'd wiped it down and reseated the components with care. The drive gear showed fresh lubrication at the contact points, the kind of thin, precise greasing that extended the life of the mechanism and that I hadn't applied because I hadn't opened the housing since the spring. Someone had been in the lamp room and had kept the mechanism the way it should be kept, not in the one visit on the night of the rescue. The evidence was of regular attention, the kind of maintenance that accumulated over time and showed in the condition of the components. 18 years, she'd said. I stood in the lamp room and thought about that. 18 years of keeping a light that existed fully in her world, and only as a dark structure in mine. The same mechanism, the same lens, the same tower. One of them operational and one of them not. Both of them cared for. I put the housing back and finished the structural check and wrote up the report and locked the base door behind me. The light was dark. The headland was quiet. The channel ran in both directions below, the same water it had always been, going about its business in the morning light. I drove back to the harbour and started the day.